Welcome to Dr Joe Unplugged. This podcast contains general information and is not in any way medical advice. Sporting contests will have teams and they'll have an umpire or referee. Typically, you don't find that somebody from the team acts as the umpire, not because they don't know the rules, but they're not deemed to be unbiased. They have a particular view, they want their team to win, fair enough. In medicine, it is important that we have doctors who work with industry. I'll put my hand up, I have an involvement in the medicinal cannabis industry. So therefore, I'm not the person to be asked about laws, regulations and guidelines. I might be asked to have some input and offer my opinion, but ultimately the umpires, people making the decisions, cannot be paid by the industry. There needs to be a separation. Over 60% of US physicians, and I'm quoting, who served as panel and task force members for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 5th edition, received more than $14 million in publicly undisclosed industry funding, a new study shows. Because most of these payments were for food, beverage, travel and consulting fees. Now, consulting fees is a roundabout way of saying you work for the group, you don't necessarily appear on the payroll as an employee. But more than 1/3 of contributors received compensation for services other than consulting, such as serving on a pharmaceutical company's speakers bureau, which medical ethicists say is particularly problematic. Again, end quote. This is actually very important. The DSM is the sometimes referred to as the psychiatric Bible. It is the textbook by which psychiatrists and also GPs, or often known in America as family physicians, make their diagnosis. It's with the mental health issues, and obviously it's a big concern for a lot of people these days. There are typically no diagnostic tests. You don't do a blood test, that's fine, it doesn't matter. It is based on symptoms. And the DSM, the first edition of which appeared in the 1950s, attempts to gather up symptoms, put them into groupings, and then enable doctors to decide, yes, you've got enough of these symptoms, they appear in this particular cluster, perhaps for a certain period of time, certain features, we can make that diagnosis. But we also know that diagnosis necessarily leads to treatment. Again, if you get the right diagnosis, then treatment is appropriate. And there has been a tendency for the mainstay of treatment to be medications, perhaps rather than lifestyle type changes. And that is notwithstanding work that's come out that shows, for example, in mild and moderate depression, that placebo, which is an inactive tablet, is as effective as the group of medications called SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So in mild and moderate depression, there is no difference between the impact of placebo and the tablets. Now, there's not a lot of money in placebo. There is quite a lot of money to be made in antidepressant medication. Necessarily, the panel that is involved with the DSM has said, look, more or less nothing to see here. But interestingly, again, I quote, this work builds on the investigators' earlier research into financial conflicts among DSM contributors. The lack of a centralised database of industry payments made the group's prior studies far more complicated and time-consuming. So they've gone under the what's called the Sunshine Act in the United States, looking at various payments, and anything above $5,000 per year does need to be declared onto a public register. Again, doesn't sound maybe like a massive amount of money in the broader scheme of things. Again, not saying that $5,000 dropped into anybody's pocket is not a lot of money. When it's tallied up as a dinner here, a flight there, some other payment somewhere else, yeah, it's small, and it is fair to say for these doctors, it's not necessarily going to be a particularly high part of their total income. And I'm absolutely not saying that it is necessarily the case that makes them biased. However, gets back to our original analogy that if you are being paid by a sporting team, then you should not be the umpire in a game involving that team. If you are being paid by a pharmaceutical company, or in different circumstances, a device company, then you should not be making decisions which influence whether that product may or may not be used. It's not that complicated. Thanks for listening to Dr. Joe Unplugged. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like, and share. You can also follow it on all the socials. There'll be new content uploaded each week.